All right, thanks everyone for coming. This is Rethinking Base Styles. I have an alternate title, which we'll get to in a minute. I am on the tail end of some sort of cold here, so if I start hacking up along, sorry, I apologize in advance. Real quick, who am I? I am Keith Grant. I work as a web developer for Intercontinental Exchange. Who's heard of Intercontinental Exchange? Nobody has. We own the New York Stock Exchange. Who's heard of that? Okay. I don't know how that worked out, but we just did a redesign of the NYSE website this week. I'm also author of CSS in Action. I'm a foodie. I'm a runner. I realized I put the slide together. I have a Twitter account for my primary. I have a Twitter account for the book. I have a Twitter account for my cooking. I have a Twitter account for running. I kind of have a Twitter problem. In fact, I have accounts for each of my kids. I'm logged into 6 accounts on my phone right now. So I'm on there a lot. But CSS in Action, they do an early, and they call it MEEP, Manning Early Access Program. Hopefully that will be available soon. It means you can get an ebook of the partial book as I'm writing it, and then get updates as I write more. I've got about a third of it written, so making steady progress there. So what do I mean by base styles? If we're rethinking base styles, I'm stealing straight from Jonathan, his smacks. He laid it out really well this morning. You've got kind of the base styles. The first thing that go into your style sheet, they're kind of the foundation of your styles. And everything you do builds on top of that. You start to do your layout. You start to build your modules or your components or whatever you want to call them. And your base styles have kind of set the framework. And everything you build after that depends on your base styles and kind of expects the base styles to have set a foundation for your work. And so we'll be looking at some of those things. We'll be looking at some habits that have been around for a while and kind of evaluating, are those the right thing? Is there a better way to do it? How else can we approach some of these things to maybe clean up some of the code later on that depends on those base styles? Jonathan's keynote this morning was great. He actually laid the foundation for a lot of stuff that I'm going to kind of build on top of here. So, code is our enemy. I wish I found this quote earlier. This would have been the title of my talk if I had found it. Rich Skrenta has this fantastic blog post titled "Code is Our Enemy." And his point is that code is where bugs hide. Code needs to be maintained. Code needs to be understood. And we got code rot. The more code we write, the more headaches we have keeping track of that code, maintaining that code, updating that code. You've got, if you have a huge code base, a new employee comes in, it takes them a lot longer to get their heads around what's going on, how do things work. And his point here obviously isn't that we want no code. It's that we want less code. And not in the means of saving keystrokes and doing neat tricks to do in one line what should be done in 10. The point is your algorithm should be simple. You should be able to find elegant solutions that take very little logic but get you the end result you want. There's a kind of a mythic story of this guy, Bill Atkinson, who worked at Apple in the 80s. He was working on the Lisa operating system, which was one of the first graphical operating systems. And they were getting down to the wire on deadlines. They were in the final months of the project. And the managers started saying, OK, we got to hit these deadlines. We got to know what you're doing. At the end of every day, fill out this quick report that says, how many lines of code did you write? Thankfully, we don't really pay too much attention to lines of code anymore, but it was a thing, especially back then. And one day, he was working, and he found this big, nasty algorithm. And it was a mess, and it was slow. And he looked at it, and he worked through it, and he realized he could greatly simplify it. He just deleted swaths of code, rewrote the algorithm. It was much faster, much more responsive. And he got to the end of the day, and his manager said, hey, you need to fill in your form. How many lines of code did you write? He said, he stopped and he thought about it for a minute, and he wrote down -2,000. And I don't know if that put an end to his manager asking him how many lines of code he wrote, but the point was, more code was not better. Less code was way better. It was easy to understand. It was easy to make sense of. And it was faster for the computer. Compile times went down. On the internet with the web, we've got network traffic time to deal with. We want smaller code bases, but we still want all these neat features. So how do we approach our problems with elegant solutions, less code, set ourselves up for success, rather than fighting styles that we've already written? So we find ourselves in kind of an interesting situation in CSS right now. It is really exciting technology right now. The whole world has changed in the last few years. These things did not exist 5 years ago. Preprocessors, methodologies like BEM and SMAX, CSS3 features, and I think even more important than the individual features that came out in CSS3 was they did this thing where they split the specification. So CSS 2.1 was just this huge specification. It said, here's how CSS works. Here's the box model. Here's selectors. Here's everything. On CSS 3, there actually isn't a CSS 3. What they did is they broke it up into dozens of different specifications. And they said, here's a specification for selectors. Here's a specification for the box model. And that way they could iterate on each individual specification without having to bring everything up to speed at the same time. And right along with that, we started to see the birth of evergreen browsers. Chrome, Firefox, and now Edge, Safari, they're updating frequently. So as these split specifications upgrade, the browsers upgrade with them. We suddenly hit this, we were in a snail's pace. I mean, nothing changed from 2003 to 2009 in CSS. And then all of a sudden, there's just this explosion of things. We have new build tools. And so things are going to keep changing. Flexbox, great talk we just had by Chris. This year is broadly supported. It's really taking over where floats used to be. Grid layout is right around the corner. Should be landing in Chrome if it hasn't already by the end of the year. We've got new preprocessors like PostCSS and a library called CSS Next that plugs in that promise, I haven't toyed with this personally, but they kind of promise you can write future CSS specifications, and it uses polyfills and uses some preprocessor translation to do that. We've got React.js, we have inline styles. There's been a whole discussion this year. Are inline styles the way to go? Should we use this other thing, CSS modules, which looks really cool? It's real easy to get wrapped up in all this change, all these new things, all this exciting stuff going up in CSS. But I've been writing my book, and my book has forced me to go back to square one and start repeating, okay, here are the basics of CSS. Here are how these things works. Here are how we do things. And it's allowed me to kind of step back out of the chaos and go back to the basics and say, okay, we've been saying these rules for a long time. Do they really still apply? And I've been able to rethink a lot of things. And this talk is kind of the stuff that doesn't go in my book. It's a little bit outside the box. It's going to be a little bit of experimental. Use it at your own risk. Take it with a grain of salt. But I think we have a habit of setting rules for ourselves. And then we forget why we make the rule. A great example of this is, we don't use onClick in our HTML. That's really evil. And then JSX comes out, and everyone's using onClick, and people freak out. You're using onClick. Well, JSX isn't actually using onClick. The problem with onClick was you were using the global namespace. You're putting your function in the global namespace and calling that. JSX doesn't do any of that. It just syntactically looks the same as the old method. So it's important to remember why rules exist. You may hear, universal selector is slow. That's actually not true anymore. So let's start at the beginning. Let's look at a number of things we can reevaluate. HTML selector. This is likely the first or one of the first selectors in your style sheet. And here's how we usually do it. There's a lot of websites out there that do this. If you're using Bootstrap 3, you're doing this. HTML, set the font size of the whole page to 62.5%. Why do we do that?
10 pixels.
10 pixels. The math is easy. We can just say 1.4 rem. We know, we just move the decimal, divide by 10. We've got our pixels are now rems. Now it's responsive. Now it's accessible. The problem with this is we really don't have 10 pixel fonts on our page, at least unless maybe it's a little disclaimer at the bottom. What we wind up doing is this sort of thing where Okay, well, this paragraph, we'll set it to 1.4 rem, 14 pixels. This component, we'll set to 1.4 rem, 14 pixels. We'll set this other component to 1.4 rem, 14 pixels. We're doing the same thing over and over again. Why don't we just, oh, but yes, thumbs up for using M's and rems. That's accessible, so it's better, but we're still thinking in pixels. We might be writing rem, but what we're really going on in our head is px. So what if we just set the base font size to what we want? Okay, 87.5, 16 divided by, or 16 pixels, which is the browser default, times that gets us 14 pixels, if I'm remembering that correctly. Then we don't need any of those other rules. 16 pixel font, or in this case 14 pixel font, applied everywhere, which is usually what we want. And then just in a few places we can override that. Our fancy header can be 1.7 rem. Now, we lose the nice convenience of the math. Who can do real quickly in the top of the head, what's the 16 pixel base font times 87.5% times 1.7 rem? Now, the math there is not simple, but the answer is, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that your header font size is 1.7 times your base font. It's bigger, it's a little less than double the size. We need to get our brains out of the pixel perfect approach to things. We've done that with our boxes. We've done that. We're getting used to pixels, to percent and ems for our column sizing, for our elements. We need to get our head out of pixels when it comes to the font as well. We'll come back to ems. We'll come back to fonts in a way that really throws a wrench into it later. But so set your base font, what your base font actually is. It'll make it greatly reduces your style later on. Headers, H1, H2, H3. This is typically what we have. And in fact, I stole this from, I think I just took this out of Bootstrap 3. I simplified it. There's actually more going on in Bootstrap. But you've got margin on your headers, you got a default font weight, you got a line height, and then each header you set again and again and again to their own individual font sizes. The problem with this is how many of our web apps in particular use the exact same header size based on the H tag. We don't do it at all. In fact, I'll jump ahead here. I went to GitHub. We've got 4 H3s on the page, 2 H1s, and none of them are the same size. None of them are the default size for the tag. You've got all sorts of crazy rules here. I pulled up these elements in the inspector. A couple of them were overriding every single base rule. And in fact, the one on the left here is overriding margin twice. And it's not crossed out at the bottom because it's just specifying the top and bottom. And then specifying the top and bottom again. But why do we have these? We put this in our style sheet, very first thing, and we don't even need it. And then, in fact, we spend time going, oh, well, I put this header on the sidebar, and it's got this big margin. I didn't want that big margin there, so let me override the margin. Let me fix the font size, whatever. Just don't do it. Just reset them all to something innocuous, something that won't cause you pain later on. Strip out the margins or leave them as they are. It really doesn't matter because you're going to have to set a margin anyway with your classes. Your base rules should represent the most common use case. Now, don't copy this exactly and stick it in your style sheet. Look at your design, look at your web app, and say, okay, what's going on the most common? What header am I usually seeing? And put that as your default. Then you don't have to override it later on. I think I've got more here. Yeah, then these default headers that we saw at the beginning they are useful in a content block. If you've got a hierarchical text with headers and subheaders and paragraphs, they make sense. So scope them to your content container and use them there. Lists. This one is kind of a personal nag of mine. What do we use lists for? Everything. I think we've reached a point where we now use UL tag more than div tag. We use them for nav menus and drop downs and tabs, pagination, blog comments, anything in your app that has a model and a collection. You probably use a list to display it to the screen. Oh yeah, and bullet lists. Occasionally we have a bullet list on our page. Where do we put the styles for that bullet list? The base style. Let's fix that. So the base style has the padding left of, I think it's 40 pixels, a list style, a bullet, and it comes from the browser. We don't usually do too much with that, but in our tab module, we have to override that. Padding left 0, list style type none. In our drop-down menu, padding left 0, list style type none. Pagination, padding left 0, list style type none. How many times have you typed these two commands into your style sheet and you send it over the wire every time, dozens of copies of the same styles? Just fix it at the top. Reset your UL to padding left 0, list style type none. Then you don't need to worry about it when you use a UL for something that's not a bullet list. And bring them back when you need them. Scope it to your content block if that's where your text is and you are using bullet lists, or create a class module that just does it for you. There's no sense in just, okay, it's not a big deal. I mean, is it painful to write padding left 0, list style type none? No, but it's like this nagging thing in your shoe. If you're running a marathon, you've got a bit of grit or sand in your shoe, sometimes it's worth stopping, taking off your shoe, shaking it out, put your shoe back on, and get running again. It'll definitely make the race more fun. You may or may not do better as a result, but you'll enjoy it more. And the race, in this case, is not simply one project. It's not simply one web app. It's your whole career. You're doing the same thing over and over and over and over again in your career. You might as well make it easier on yourself. So those are some simple things to do. Let's get a little more adventurous. Jonathan actually brought this one up. This is a universal selector, adjacent sibling combinator, universal selector. Hayden Pickering calls this the lobotomized owl because it's like an owl's eyes in the beak and it just looks kind of sick and not happy. This selects anything next to anything else. We'll come back to that in a minute. But the scenario is basically this. You've got a container. We do this all the time. You put some padding around the container, in this case 1M, and inside we've got a widget of whatever the widget is. It really doesn't matter. And we've got nice space around the container. It's great until we had a second widget. So then you go, okay, well I have two widgets next to each other. I need some space in between them. Well, I can fix it with margin. The alignment's a little off on the screen size, sorry there. We can put a margin top on there. Then you get this double margin, the margin on the top plus the padding, and then the space doesn't look quite right at the top of the element. What about this? Widget plus a widget, so adjacent sibling. Any widget that immediately follows another widget gets a top margin. Then the top one doesn't get it. The bottom two get the top margin, and they're spaced evenly. We fix the problem. Oh, now we have two widgets and a dongle inside our container. What happens now? It's broken. Hayden Pickering says, margin is like applying glue to one side of an object before you've determined whether you actually want to stick that object to something else. These green names in my slides are actually links. There's a link to his article about lobotomized owl. But he makes a great point. This is a really frustrating problem. How do we fix an even padding between any different mix and match of elements that we stick inside of a container and make it all even and look pretty no matter what we do with the HTML? And he proposes this. He says, lobotomized owl selector. So any element that is an immediate adjacent sibling to another element, give it a margin top. It only puts glue between two elements when they're next to each other, regardless of what they are. And it works really well. In this case, the selector targets the second widget, and it targets the green widget, and it puts the space in there. It even works when you nest containers within containers. In this case, we target the inner container with the lobotomized owl. We give it a top margin, so it spaces evenly. We target the third widget, and then inside the inner container, we target only the second widget, and the spacing is just even. Really, the only time you're not going to want this is when you've got items side by side rather than top to bottom. So if you've got a grid system and you've got columns, what it's going to do is it's going to shift all but your first column down a little. You don't want that. So in select cases, you can override it. But I haven't actually used this in production. Hayden Pickering says he's been using it for 6 months, 9 months, and hasn't really had any problems with it. I really want to toy with it. I want to try it out. But it sounds like something that can really simplify our code. Excuse me. Some people see that star, that asterisk, and go, oh, that's bad. We've been trained not to do that. The truth is, the universal selector is actually really performant in all modern browsers. It's been good since IE 7. And the other thing to consider here is that what we're also doing is we're reducing the number of selectors in our code overall. So it's not just that this selector might be slow, it's that, yeah, well, maybe it's a little slower than a normal selector, but you've gotten rid of dozens of other selectors in your style sheet. So you're probably actually having a net gain, even if it isn't the most performant selector. Media queries. What do we do with media queries? All right, we style our widget for the default case, which is usually mobile. And then we say, okay, if it's a little bit bigger, override a few styles, do a few things. If it's a little bit bigger, you know, tablet size, override some styles, do a few things. And this can get cognitively really difficult to keep track of what's going on. If you've just got 1 or 2 styles inside of those media queries, it's usually not too bad. But it's when they start doing all sorts of crazy stuff like shifting layouts and doing things. This can be really, some of the nastiest parts of my code base are where I've got a complicated thing that needs to do different stuff, all these different screen sizes. How many of you have seen this website? It's been around a year or two. I normally wouldn't balk at putting some language in my talk, but this one was a little excessive. But he makes a great point. He says, here's a web page. It is fast, it is responsive, it just works, it's accessible. It has no CSS, has no JavaScript, and it does what it's supposed to do. He says this at the bottom. He says, websites aren't broken by default. They're functional, high-performing, and accessible. You break them. And in this battle for prettier websites, better-looking design, more, fancier features, we just bog our websites down more and more and more with heavier style sheets, with heavier rules. And obviously, you aren't going to ship a website that looks like this. You need some styles. You need to pretty it up. But you've got to remember that everything you do has a cost. These problems are our own making. If we have trouble with responsive design, it's because we did something to the page that made it not responsive. If we have trouble with vertical centering is a piece of cake. Give it an equal padding on the top and the bottom. It's centered. The problem is not vertical centering. The problem is that we set a fixed height. And there are reasons we need to do that, and that's fair. I'm not saying stop it altogether. But everything we do comes with a cost. I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name. Dieter Rams, he's a German designer who has these 10 principles for good design, says, good design is as little design as possible. I think this is why we've seen a rise in minimalistic design, flat design, because it's simpler in the style sheet, because it doesn't take as much work to do. And even if you do have really complicated styles going on, it gives the impression of lightness. It gives the impression to the user of fast, responsive website. Okay, so all that, come back to media queries. How do we get somewhere by simplifying our media queries? How do we still get a good responsive design? One, this is really straightforward, but leverage line wrapping. Use styles that will just naturally line wrap. Inline block. Now, inline block has its problems. I'll give you that. But it's great for this. If you've got some sort of fixed tile, say it's an avatar or you've got a gallery of images, just use inline block, set the width to whatever it needs to be. Mobile, it works. tablet size, it works. Large screen size, it works. There is a place for this. Obviously, it's not globally usable for everything. You've got an issue on the paddings on the sides. The margins kind of vary. You know, if you go here, you see they're a little bit bigger, and it's just going to depend on the size of the user browser. But if that's acceptable to you, go for it. Do it. The other thing you can do is leverage Flexbox. You can do Flexbox with a fallback to floats if you really have to support IE9. But it really doesn't take much code to do a very responsive layout. Here we've got display flex on the container with flex wrap. And we set a min width on the item inside. And that just causes it to wrap. So it means it won't shrink to fit on the first row. And it wraps beautifully. Very large screen, it wraps beautifully again. And you get the benefit here of, you know, you may want this, you may not, but the bottom three stretched. It stretches to fill, you get nice flush margins on the side. Very responsive. You can do whatever you want with the screen size here, and it works. Other thing you can do, use viewport relative units. So these are the viewport relative units. VW, these just kind of snuck up on me. I don't know about you guys, but I was just thumbing around on MDN one day, and there was no fanfare about these things. And I looked and I saw them, and I was like, wow, these are really useful. I wonder when they'll be available in browsers. And I checked browser support, and it's everywhere. It's almost everywhere. There are a few minor quirks, but I don't know when these snuck into specification, but they just popped up one day, and they work, and they're beautiful. So the way these work is VW is effectively a percentage of the browser, or sorry, the viewport width. VH, percentage of the height. Vmin is whichever is the smaller of the two, and Vmax is whichever is the larger of the two. So instead of M or M percent pixel, you just use VW, VH. The asterisk on Vmax is what you're seeing in the yellow there in IE. Vmax is not supported in IE. But thankfully, that's the one of the four you'll need the least. So how do we use them? What if we use them for our font size? So in this element, font size is a calc of 0.5M plus 2 VWs. So the font size will scale with the browser window. And then the 0.5M kind of acts as a minimum. It will never shrink below that, even if the browser window is a pixel. Obviously, you won't quite reach that, so hopefully a reasonable browser size, you'll stay at around 1M. But if you scale, the font scales with it. Font scales with it again. A guy named Vasilis, I forget his last name. He had a strange, hard to pronounce last name. He has a website where he used this on his menu, and his nav menu, and he can just do anything with the screen size, and his nav menu always fits in the screen. And he did it purely with this. It's really powerful if you use M padding as well, because then the padding will scale with it. It'll all be calculated based on the viewport width. So those are great. You should use them. And then kind of my last point is use dynamic values. Here we have a form. We set a font size 1M, or 1 rem actually, set a color, and then all the inputs inside of it, we do two things. We use M for the padding, the font size, the border radius, and we use this keyword current color for the border color. And we make sure that the color is inherited, which would normally happen, but browser styles on forms set some explicit colors on forms sometimes. So you want to make sure you inherit the color. The only problem here is the padding doesn't work on the select box because select boxes are dumb. Sorry, I don't have a quick solution to that one. So what can you do with that? We have the M's. We'll close look at the M's. Because the font size is inherited from the parent, which is the form, all we have to do is change the font size on the form. and it changes the font size on everything inside the form. It changes the padding on everything inside the form. It changes the border radius on everything inside the form. With one line of CSS, we've scaled the entire form, however we want to. And because of color, we can do a similar thing with color. Set the color on the form to red, the font size, the border color, which is set to current color, are all red. Set them to blue. You can mix and match these easily. You could do a large red form, you could do a small blue form, all with just a couple lines of CSS. Really cool ways you could leverage this. You can mix and match this a number of different ways. So think about your code. As you find yourself writing something and you think, boy, I've written this a few times now. I've done this same sort of thing a few times now. This is really a headache. Take a moment to step back. Think about your style sheet. Think about why you have to do that thing that's driving you crazy, and see if you can find a solution that is more general purpose, that fixes everything more broadly across your site. See if you can make the algorithm of your style sheet more simple, less complicated. Make your code do the work for you. Thank you.